Hi, I'm Steve Kimes of Eugene Mennonite Church. So I just want to let you know that I'm not talking to my good Christian friends today. I'm talking to my homeless friends or people who were homeless. That doesn't mean that you can't listen. If you're not homeless or whatever, you're totally welcome to listen. Happy to have you come along. So have you heard that Jesus was homeless? There's that verse, Matthew 8, Luke 9. Foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Uh, somebody may have mentioned that Jesus was homeless. In homeless lingo, he would have been called a couch surfer, going from one home to another. And both he and his disciples had times where they had to sleep under the stars, but that situation actually wasn't as frequent. Often he slept in homes, often in homes of people that he had just met that day. He never had a room to himself, mind you. He slept in a main room because most of the homes that he stayed in were one room houses. So he would be there with his disciples and his hosts. The only home he stayed in more frequently was that of his disciple, Peter. He was there so often that when he was in Peter's hometown, Capernaum, he called Peter's home his home. So people would say, "Oh, Jesus' home," meaning Peter's home. He's at Peter's home. Jesus also stayed there during the day, often to a packed room when he's teaching, standing room only. So suppose Jesus came round today and he's wandering from town to town just like he did back in the day, and he's wanting to speak at a church or stay at a good Christian home. Well, he'd probably have a hard time finding folks like that. Despite the facts that he taught his disciples to offer hospitality to each other, to wash each other's feet, to invite strangers into their homes, to go out of their way to make sure that people had a place to sleep, Jesus probably wouldn't get a place to stay today. Now, Jesus back in the day would travel from town to town on his feet, sometimes in sandals, sometimes not. He was thin, he had ragged clothes, and he was stinky. I mean, he didn't get to bathe every day, and he traveled on foot a lot, so you could smell him before you saw him. His hair was filthy, his feet were disgusting, and the clothes, well, his clothes could probably stand up by themselves if he could get them off, which he didn't very often. He was also a person of color. Now, that didn't matter so much back in the day, maybe a little bit, but not a lot, but it would matter today. He'd have to go the extra mile to get a good white Christian to give him more than a glance, let alone. But it doesn't really matter. If a stinky, dirty person of color was found on the back door of a church, he'd be asked to leave, and then he'd be told to leave. And then they would call the police on him, and we hope that the police are in a good mood that day and wouldn't shoot Jesus Christ right there on church property. Because the far majority of Christians in the West are afraid of people who live on the street. They see them as disgusting. They don't want them in their communities. They would be happy if Jesus came to one of their soup kitchens. And then they could have the safe distance of at least a counter between them and Jesus. And they'd be happy to see Jesus at a clothing closet where they could hand him some clothes and some food, and then Jesus would go away. But suppose that Jesus showed up at their Bible study and started one of his favorite sermons. "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. But woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your judgment." Well, they'd ask him to be quiet. They'd tell him to stop being judgmental. And if Jesus insisted on speaking in the church that has his name right at the title out on the street, they'd show him the door. And if he wouldn't leave, they'd call the police. And if Jesus wouldn't leave then, he'd be handcuffed, charged with trespassing, and kept in jail until he learned his lesson. So, for those who listen, hear this. If you live on the street, don't feel bad about how church people treat you. They treat Jesus exactly the same way because you are Jesus to these church folk. And if they rejected you, they've rejected him.